Reviews. Hello and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining today, October 30, 2024, Kubernetes open source SIG API Machinery bi-weekly meeting. I was making the joke that we moved from not having enough agenda to having a lot of super interesting topics before we started the recording. So why don't we get into these? Um, and I've been talking with Andrew and carlory in the background to make sure that they were able to join this meeting. So we have them here. So Andrew, do you want to uh, take the first one?
Sure. Thank you for making the time. Over in SIG storage, there's a cap for VolumeAttributesClass, which allows users to modify the parameters of the persistent volumes. For example, I have a volume with IOPS 3000. I want to have a certain class. I can then make it have a expensive volume attribute class that'll bump it up to 10,000 IOPS, input output operations per second, to get through a sudden spike in usage and then go back to the default lower IOPS is kind of the use case. We want to add quota restrictions for volume attributes so that administrators can limit the amount of maybe expensive volume attribute class types in use or to a certain amount. When originally adding the volume attributes class API, DeadsDK suggested we use Quota scope and scopeSelector to implement this feature instead of having a new parameter on the volume attribute class API. But we ran into, or carlory, when making the PR, ran into a bug or an issue that is issue 124436, where the quota scopes can't handle the transition case from one scope to another when the target object is updated. And we left the quota feature out of the initial push of this feature to beta, and in Kubernetes 131, there were a lot of SIG API machinery scalability efforts, but we were wondering what we should do to unblock this. I know DeadsDK looked at the issue on this Slack thread, and it's there was a lot of back and forth, and we just wanted to see what next step would be for us and whether we should still rely on scopeSelector. And yeah, so I'll open the issue. Yeah, you have it open. Great. Specifically, this impact. Sorry.
It is a difficult one. So let me see if I remember this one correctly. This is the one where when a change happens to a separate resource, so not the quota resource, but a resource that is controlled by quota, when we go through the reclamation loop in the controller, it does not reclaim the quota. Is that correct? Or am I misremembering it?
Yeah, so the failure we want to prevent here in our volume attribute class use case is you're only allowed one expensive VAC in the namespace. But you want maybe two volumes with that expensive VAC. You create one PVC pointing to that expensive VAC, and then you set an invalid VAC that you try to modify to. So you're hiding the fact that there's a VAC there, and then you create another PVC with the expensive VAC, and suddenly you can have more usage of an expensive VAC than anticipated. But yeah, that's, I think, the understanding of your understanding is correct.
So it's a bug. I'm not going to claim that it's an easy bug to solve.
Um, so Drew, from my superficial understanding of the timeline for this, it sounds like at the beginning, you were leaving this quota functionality out of the scope, but now it's blocking you because now it's included, right? That's something that, yeah. Go ahead.
So the quota piece was initially in the scope to push this KEP to beta.
Okay.
We cut that out of the beta scope because the KEP is off by default anyway because there was an API change. So we want to have one full round where VAC is in beta with quota in there, so that way users can provide feedback before we push the KEP to GA. So we're blocked in the sense that we really want to make quotas part of this feature while it's still in beta, so that way GA isn't the first time with quotas, or so we don't delay the GA promotion of VolumeAttributesClass. So I guess our next step is, do we think that this bug is solvable, or would we have to find the workaround of not relying on scopeSelector for this kind of
I don't think not relying on a scope selector is a solution, right? Like if you look at it, this is exactly what a scope selector is for, right? Bypassing the mechanism because it is bugged, it will produce a strictly less desirable API.
Makes sense.
So we need to find a volunteer, right, David? To
Someone to
look
help
at
out
this.
would be great. Being able to review it once someone finds the solution for it would be great. I do believe it is solvable, right? All the scopes are present, just not evaluated.
Okay. I don't want to make any promises, but let me see if anybody from my side can take a look. At least to make some progress, do some analysis, try to find a problem, and maybe then, save a lot of time from David and run it by David with, something more digestive to see if we can solve it. If this is a bug, how is the time looking until 132 post-release? How much more do we have?
We have until November 4th, so that seems pretty tough. But I guess on the SIG storage has two paths. One, which is just have this KEP bake in beta one more time while this, or moving volume attribute class forward without quotas and adding quotas later, as long as it's a non-breaking change, which is what some of the KEP contributors thought it would be. It would not be a non-breaking change. So
I would agree this would be non-breaking, because even if this came out, it would be not uniform across every cluster, right? There would be those that would choose to enforce this and those that would choose not to. And even inside of a single cluster, there would be cases of this namespace has it and that namespace doesn't.
Okay, this is what I can commit right now. Hopefully today, maximum by tomorrow, end of day. Drew, David, I can let you know if I can find somebody to take a look to this. So we can go plan A, which is try to solve the bug. And if I can't, we have to go plan B. Sounds good?
thank you so much for taking a look and revisiting the issue. Appreciate it.
Okay. Great. So I mute myself, but I keep running the meeting. Thank you. So that's on me, action item for me. Let's go to the second one. Was this Joe to add this one?
Yeah, I added this one. So this is, I think, mostly just informational, but this is a cap to do pod vertical scaling. I think it's a valuable feature. It's being done through a resize sub-resource, which gives you access to the root pod resource, but only allows you to write to specific fields. So I've been working kind of in the last couple of days trying to get support for some of the gaps that existed in this, and I just wanted to shine some light on it because we don't do a lot of sub-resource development in Kubernetes, and the API machinery hasn't seen as much development as other features, and that kind of became pretty apparent as we started working on this. So there's one set of issues I've opened around having a better way to express which fields are reset, which is really important for field management. And then I also opened an issue, that second issue down. Did I link to it here? I also opened an issue against the website asking for more API reviewer guidance around how we should approach, this isn't it, how we should approach sub-resources. Like if you come to an API review and you're adding a sub-resource, what should you expect, which questions you need to answer, stuff like that. Let me find a link to that. Mostly I wanted to get some eyes on that one. Let's see.
Did I open the right link?
Here, let me grab it for you. Website. I'll hunt it down in a second. So I had opened. Oh, it wasn't against the website. It was against the contributors pages. I wanted to try and accumulate as much information as we could about what the guidance is for adding sub-resources, what things that we should be watching for, and stuff like that. So I'll send a link out for that. But that's all I had on the topic, unless people have questions.
Do we want to? So I think many people would find this to be a really esoteric thing. So my memory of get reset fields is a way to describe, maybe you want to describe what that is.
Yeah.
So people can see whether it relates to their sub resource or not. And then where this one lands, because I saw that the conversation had evolved from submitting an entire pod to maybe we don't submit an entire pod.
Yeah, I'd only seen it in passing before this. So this was my first time where I really got to know it. So what happens is some sub resources allow you to access a resource, but not all of it. In fact, every time you access the status sub resource of a resource, you see the whole resource. So if you do a read, you just get the entire pod back. But you can only write to the status fields when you do a update to the status sub resource. But you can send the whole pod. And what happens is when you send the whole pod, anything that you put in the spec just gets reset or ignored, right? It's as though you didn't send it. It doesn't get validated. It doesn't get written. The system does a read of the current state, applies your status to the status, and then does a write. And doesn't care what you put in the spec. And so that's what resetting is. And so typically what you'll see in our APIs is not only do you actually reset the fields in your strategy by hand, which is a little tedious, but very procedural, right? Like there's a function you have to implement called get reset fields, where you say reset status. You just put the string status, and then the system knows. Well, there's two things that tells the system to ignore those fields for field management, which is used by server-side apply, but then also in your strategy, you actually have to go and reset the fields. So you have to do two things and they have to agree. I don't find this like really convenient at all, but that's what you have to do. The case that got harder with this resize sub-resource, instead of writing to an entire stanza, like the entire spec stanza or the entire status stanza, you're writing to very select fields deeply nested within an object, right? So it's within a pod, you've got the containers, and with the containers, you've got resources, and you can write those resources fields and only those resource fields. And so the reset is reset all the fields except for those. And then also you have to tell server-side apply, here's the mask of the things that should be ignored when you compute field management. So it's pretty involved.
So in all honesty, I may actually have missed this. Was there a test that caught it?
No, we were looking at it and trying to figure out how everything was supposed to behave, and we just eyeballed it.
All right. I'm glad we found it. It looks like they were leaning towards actually making a different resource type to pass through to this endpoint, so it would be similar to scale.
Yeah, and I didn't get fully involved in that conversation. So I'm curious as to what the deciding factors were there, because it seemed to me, and with the conversation, it seemed to Tim at the time, that having these, like, the scale sub resource is really interesting. So the scale sub resource, when you read it, you get its own kind, and it only shows you a couple fields that you care about. And so that's it. It's really simple, right? You just see the fields that you would modify to scale something, and you don't see all of the deployment or all of a replica set. The choice not to do that here is interesting, and I'm not sure what all the deciding factors are. So I'd love to get that captured.
Okay. Thanks for the explanation. I thought it might be useful if someone wants to create a new sub-resource. It's not all fun and games.
Yeah, I just found this link. Where do I go to? I'm gonna throw it in chat now. So if anybody wants to hop on, you can. I never use Zoom, and I don't know what any of the buttons are. Anyways, I'll drop something in the chat in a minute.
Is there a concrete action item or follow-up that we have to take as part of this one, or just the discussion and awareness?
I think anybody that's interested in this, it'd be really good to follow up with the updates that we make to our contributor documentation.
Great. Thank you, Joe. And the chat, can you also link it in the document for posterity? This one.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'll go add it there.
Thank you so much. Okay, let's get to the next one, which is Gateway API versioning. And I don't know who wants to start. Maybe Flynn, I see you're on the call. You want to?
Yeah, I can start.
Yeah.
This whole thing was actually pretty interesting. This is a document that I ended up writing about 5 months ago for Gateway API's internal use. Antonio ended up running over it early Saturday morning, my time, and posting it to SIG API Machinery, with the result that I woke up on Saturday and ended up feeling an awful lot like I'd been summoned to a surprise thesis review or defense or something like that, which was kind of entertaining. Ultimately, Gateway API is in the situation where we want to provide an experimental channel where we can do API design that is guided by actual feedback from people trying things, with the full knowledge that since we are not perfect API designers, there will be times where the feedback from the users needs to be dealt with by a breaking change. At the same time, it's the experience of folks that conversion webhooks ended up being, I think the way Jordan described it in Slack, was oppressively difficult, both to write and to operate. And so we are really trying to find a way to both allow breaking changes in the experimental world and not have to use conversion webhooks, and figure out a way that we can do that and then promote things to a stable channel, a standard channel rather, where people can have all of the stability guarantees that we normally associate with Kubernetes APIs. This is challenging. There is a lot of discussion in this doc and in its comments. There's some on Slack. It's mostly moved over to the docs now. This tries to lay out some things that we considered and then rejected, as well as things that we still consider to be goals. And ultimately, yeah, we're trying to find a way to make this sort of thing work, recognizing that there are going to be times that we have to do breaking changes, and we would like to find a way that this can be reasonable for the users who get affected by that. One of the particularly challenging things here is that there isn't really a way with the existing API server implementation to know whether a resource was written before or after an experimental breaking change. And that ends up being at the root of a lot of things that have been suggested and found wanting, as well as things that have been suggested and seem like extra challenges. Rob, you're also on this call. Did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Glenn. I think maybe a good summary is many in the Gateway community have found API versioning challenging, confusing, any number of things. And we have found that to be a point of friction, I guess you could say, particularly in all the things we're saying people can't do. For example, what we've said to implementations is you should not bundle CRD management, CRDs when you install your controller, right? And that is just one more point of friction where you have what I would call a multi-tenant API with multiple controllers operating in the same cluster. And all of them need to somehow behave nicely. And there's less predictability in terms of what version of CRDs are present in that cluster. I think we have lots of room for discussion about this at Contrib Summit, et cetera. Like, how do we make this experience better? I think Gateway has been on the forefront of this space of getting to feel all the pain points a bit earlier than many. So for better or worse, this is maybe a doc, I appreciate Flynn for writing this up, but I think this helps illustrate some of the both pain points and confusion that has been experienced along the way.
A specific example of what Rob is talking about there with multi-tenants, APIs, and such is there's a bug right now that's open where Linkerd and Traffic both try to use Gateway API, and for various reasons, unless you explicitly say otherwise to Linkerd, then I believe the situation is that Linkerd by default will install the Gateway API CRDs in gateway.networking.k8s.io, but you can turn it off. And I believe that Traffic will install them and you don't have a way to turn it off. And so those two products, which should play nicely together, can end up fighting with each other. Jordan, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks for the doc. It's always exciting to come to a doc that was written like a year ago and then start leaving a bunch of comments on it. But
it's exciting for me too.
I like taking a step back. I don't think I still have clarity on the sort of user stories that you're trying to accomplish. So like you have, I think, at least 3 actors, sort of the cluster administrator, you have the user who's writing into specs of gateway APIs, and you have controllers that are acting on those and maybe writing status and doing things. And then in the mix, you also have like experimental fields. And I maybe it's in the doc and I just couldn't pull it out.
No, I think you're right.
Context of the doc, but
yeah,
I'm trying to
understand. I think you're right. I think that since this was an internal thing,
okay,
the audience already had this context, and I did not try to go through and explain that, which has been part of what makes it so exciting to have people leap on to leave the comments here.
Like in the scenarios I can envision are you have a new field in an experimental schema,
hmm
and you get some experience with it, and now you want to promote it to the stable schema. That's like the happy path. I think
Yes.
that's pretty easy. Like you want to promote it as is, so you just like copy it over into the stable schema, and anyone who was using it gets it for free, and anyone who is just using stable, it's a new field to them, but it's fine. Like that's the happy path.
Right.
Okay.
Would it help if I just run over some of the things that we've actually seen happen quickly? I think I can do that quickly.
Yes.
Okay, so one thing we have definitely seen is the happy path that you just described, where, to pick a specific example, we added a timeouts stanza to HTTP route. It showed up in experimental. People used it in experimental. People said, oh, yeah, this probably works. And then as of whatever release it was, probably 1.0, that stanza showed up in the HTTP route in the standard channel, and people continued using it, and all was well. Another thing that has actually happened is there is another field or another resource called backend TLS policy, where that one appeared in experimental, had some stuff. Rob will keep me honest on the details here, or Mike, I think Mike showed up. But there came a point where we realized that a number of the fields in that resource had names that were confusing people. And so we changed the names, which was 100% a breaking change. And we, went to the people that we knew of who were using it and said, hey, we're going to do this breaking change. We're really sorry. And they expressed their unhappiness and agreed that that was the most sane way to do it. And so we changed all the names. That resource has not, go ahead.
Did you rev the version of that resource when you changed the names?
Yeah.
Okay. And did a conversion get written to translate the old field into the new field?
No. So what you'll see as a common thread here is that all our problems or rough edges are related to experimental channel, in my opinion.
I would agree
for
with
those
that.
not familiar with experimental channel, imagine for a minute if you had a version of Kubernetes that was all feature gates on, regardless of status, like all alpha feature gates on. That is experimental channel. We have a standard channel of CRDs, which is the opposite of that, which is GA only things. Standard channel has been smooth sailing, whatever. The problem is transitioning between the two, or even different versions of experimental channel. So we make no guarantees between experimental channel, whatever. But the other thing is, hey, I wanted to try out this experimental thing, experimental new feature. So I installed the experimental CRD. So I wanted to turn on a feature gate, imagine. And then I want to transition back to standard channel when it goes, and that gets really messy because, for example, experimental channel can include alpha API versions that are not included in standard channel. And then you get into how do you ensure that migration has worked well? There's a lot of rough edges in that path.
Is the expectation for people who are using experimental things that there will always be a migration path back to stable? Or is it reasonable to say, oh, you used experimental and you created alpha objects, or you created objects that use experimental fields? If you want to go back to stable, you actually need to delete those and like unset those fields or delete them, or like stop using all the experimental bits. Is it
This is a matter of some discussion.
Migration back to stable that you're looking for?
Yeah, this is exactly as Flynn said, a matter of some discussion. My preference has strongly been that we should provide no guarantees in experimental channels. So for example, that change that Flynn was describing for backend TLS policy, we did a version rev from alpha 2 to alpha 3. And the only migration path was to uninstall old CRD and reinstall and install new CRD. But that's not popular. There's a lot of friction there for sure.
Another thing that's worth pointing out is that even if you don't necessarily have a migration path to standard, being able to do a good job of providing things like a way to check to make sure that you aren't using any of these experimental features would be nice. And it can be challenging because we can't tell reliably what version of the API was written in the first place.
The version that was written, I don't think is the issue. It's the fields that were persisted, which are observable via the API, right?
As I think I mentioned on the doc, and I have to try to be careful about how I phrase this one, right?
Yeah.
If you are using the strongly typed clients, then in some situations, I believe you actually need to know which version of the thing you should be using to deserialize so that you can know for certain that a given field is not present versus knowing for certain that it's not present in your version. Rob, were you going to correct something on that?
No, I have a bit of a rabbit hole to go down, so you can keep on.
I want to press on that just a
strongly
little
typed
bit.
clients
Like,
are definitely lossy if you are linked to different Go versions. Like
Yeah,
if
but
you're linked to an
lossy
old Go version
how?
that's missing a field, yeah, the strongly typed client will drop it, so you won't know.
But
So
lossy how is the bit that's interesting here. So normally when someone uses a strongly typed client, if a field is not in that strongly typed client, they don't care what that value is. And it is the API designer that makes sure that when an old client communicates with a new server, reasonable things happen. That's part of the reason why server-side apply exists. That's why patch exists and is used, so that when using those, new writers and old writers can coexist. And so in the cases that you're talking about, if patch had been used or if a server-side apply had been used, do you still run into issues? Or is it, because I'm trying to figure out how you would, right? How you would run into those issues.
Yeah, this might be where laying out the use cases that we're trying to improve. The happy path, I used experimental stuff and now I want to clean up, like know what I need to clean up, know how to clean it up.
Mm-hmm.
I used experimental stuff and now I want to migrate that to whatever replaced the experimental stuff on the way to removing the old version of the experimental stuff. And which actors are going to be doing those things? That it would be super helpful to sort of know what you're trying to do.
And I think it's completely fair to say, I certainly think it's fair for us to go back and try to construct some of that. That is likely to be helpful. We have some of that in other places, but of course it doesn't appear here.
Yeah. Rob had a rabbit hole.
I was about to say, Rob, what's your rabbit hole?
Well, I mean, so it's related to this experimental migration path and whether or not it should exist at all. And one of the things I proposed earlier, I think in basically the same era as this doc existed, was that maybe we should use a different API group for experimental and give up on any idea of migration between resources, between channels.
Give up on the idea of migration or the migration?
Well, no, you can migrate, but you have to create new things. You can't just say, oh, I'm just going to change the CRD to standard and keep on using all the same resources. You need to recreate that world.
Breaking changes within the experimental channel. Like if the experimental channel is all separate API group, still like V1 Alpha 1, V1 Alpha 2, if we break it, that's still difficult to manage.
Yeah. I should probably point out that Rob and I are kind of on opposite sides in terms of the migration path thing, where I feel like it would be a really good thing to have some way of doing migration, even if it's, a tool that we are writing that reads the experimental channel API group and writes other resources that you can apply, right? Wow, Rob has brought up some really fascinating rabbit holes as we've talked about this over time, and it is a hard thing.
There's also multiple spots you can hook in something like that. Like if you want to if you're trying to let users who have manifest
by which you mean end users who are
end
creating
user,
resources.
you know,
Yes. Okay.
I wrote my spec to do XYZ, and I was
Right.
happy with it, but then the experimental thing went away or changed somehow. Like a
Yep.
tool that takes a manifest and munges the manifest to say, but that was the old way, this is the new way.
Mm-hmm.
A fix up for local manifests is a thing that we've done in the past. That's pretty different than servers that had experimental stuff turned on and experimental data persisted. Now we'll do in-place live rewrites to carry experimental persisted stuff along to the new world. Like if you're doing that, I feel like it's not really experimental. You're treating experimental stuff as it was actually like beta or supported, and at that point, what's the point of calling it experimental?
Personally speaking, the main thing that I would like to be able to support is some manner of you have your controller running. There's been a breaking change, and whoever is doing this has gotten into a situation where they try to have a mismatched controller and experimental CRD. It would be really nice to have a way for the controller to recognize, a good solid way to have the controller recognize that out of syncness exists so that it can crash instead of just doing the wrong thing. I do not believe that it's reasonable to have experimental not be experimental in the manner that you're talking about. But even knowing, even recognizing that the conflict exists and that your controller is running with a CRD that's out of sync is interesting in some situations.
I think the top level versions, like the endpoint versions, are the signal that the controller has a version it can recognize. And when we start mixing fields and breaking changes within a single version, I think that's what seems off to me.
So
when you say
V1 Alpha 2 and it behaves this way today, and tomorrow we're going to keep V1 Alpha 2 available and readable and writable, but it behaves differently. That's strange.
I think we always do version revs for breaking changes. What we don't do is the new fields. It's similar to Kubernetes Upstream, where new fields hide behind feature gates and then they're available, right? Or they get dropped and tombstoned, whatever. And so that, I think, is leading to some of the confusion where somebody sees I'm using V1 Alpha 2 of, I don't know, backend TLS policy, and it has these three fields in one version, but it doesn't in another, but it just says V1 Alpha 2. How do I distinguish between the two, right? It's similar to the feature gate problem, in my opinion.
Also, to clarify, Jordan, when you say the endpoints that are available, you're talking about going and asking, hey, which API versions are around, and just using the existence, correct? Or are you thinking of something else?
I mean, existence or like actually using the endpoints. You have a controller listing watching V1 Alpha 2 objects. The things that it reads from the V1 Alpha 2 list watch, as long as it can successfully list watch V1 Alpha 2, the data it gets back from the server should not change meaning. If you have specific fields that get added in the experimental schema and then later dropped, like those objects without those fields should be interpreted the same way they always were in V1 Alpha 2. So I don't know the details of like what breaking changes you mean, like renames or absence meant one thing in one version and a different thing in a different version, or I don't know the details of what has been added in the experimental channel.
we've done, I mean, we have done a lot of things where the new fields will appear. We have done one thing where things got renamed. That's the one place that we have historically done a breaking change already. David.
Yeah, so one of the things that you mentioned was users don't, or not clients, and you didn't specify which client, don't know whether they're dealing with an experimental API that has field X or actually, I guess they would have no way to distinguish whether it was a experimental or they had been installed on a level that later had promoted it to stable. They would have no way of knowing this.
Right.
But are you saying essentially that a controller doesn't have an external signal to say, yep, we're using experimental things, and what you'd like to have is the CRD carry some kind of information to say, this one's experimental, versus saying, we have an external signal we store somewhere in the cluster, or it is out of band for whatever is installing and orchestrating all the add-on pieces that are being done, to say we are experimental of this level. Is that the core of the missing piece? Because otherwise, because if you have that information, you don't end up needing to look at what fields are there. You've been told it's experimental of this level and it matches you.
So I'm wavering a little bit because basically because this is a thing that we are kind of wrestling with internally around, excuse me, around what is necessary, what is sufficient, what would help. The thing that I can say with the most certainty is that right now, the machinery that's present in the API server for dealing with multiple versions, for dealing with conversion, is the conversion webhook, which, and again, I shall quote Jordan's comment on Slack because I found it very, very evocative. Conversion webhooks are oppressively difficult to write and to operate. So the things that we have available to us are conversion webhooks can see more about the API version than anything else on the system, as far as I can tell. There's nothing that allows us to fetch a resource and know for certain what version it was stored with, which will give us a signal about the intention of the author when they stored it. And we would really, 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 really like to not do conversion webhooks. So those three things combined make our lives difficult. That's really what I'm saying. I really would like to go.
So
Go
I
ahead.
think that having an API where it is important to know the API version that something was stored with, or the I guess sub revision that something was stored with, in order to know the intention of the author, it is an API that seems incredibly difficult for people to work with, right? Being able to look and say, this is the level that exists today, is sort of the central premise of how kube controllers are written. And if that premise is invalid, if instead it is, I need to know the state of the world when something was created, that ends up making it much harder for all clients to consume.
This is a place where there are ways that I feel like that is different if you're dealing with knowing that you are doing experimental work versus knowing that you have already reached a point of stability. Everything you just said, I completely agree with once you know that the thing is stable. And that is one of the interesting things there. Go ahead.
The meaning of an object not being able to be understood based on just seeing the current content of the object is what I'm hung up on. Like
yeah, it's
that I don't understand that at all. Like needing state in addition to the content of the object to understand the intent is very strange to me.
I'm going to have to go through and write down a good example of this,
Yeah.
but
Like
a kind of, an off-the-cuff kind of example here is that if you're using the Python API client and you go through and you say, hey, just give me anything you have, then you're in a place where you can pretty easily observe changes in renamed fields and stuff like that, right? No matter what the designers did and no matter what's been going on. If you're using the Go clients and you say, hey, I want you to give me this schema, then it is much harder to observe potential breaking changes.
again, like breaking changes. So there is an unstructured client in the Go client library. You can do that.
It's also kind of oppressively difficult, but yeah, you can do it.
I think it would help to understand the user journeys, like experimental, but with a nice off ramp for people who were using experimental things that didn't pan out. Like, I'm not sure I understand what you're looking for there. If you want to avoid writing conversion webhooks, which I would recommend everyone avoid them.
So just as background, I'm the original author of Emissary. We used conversion webhooks in Emissary, so you do not need to convince me to avoid them anymore.
I was the one saying no. There should be two points in the life cycle of a CRD. There should be alpha and make all the breaking changes you want and delete everything and recreate it in between. And then once you're stable, then additive changes only. Like anyway. Those are the two ways to avoid needing to do conversion webhooks, right? You treat your experimental stuff, when your whole object is experimental early on, it's experimental and breaking changes are fine, and consumers will have to delete and recreate. Like, alpha 1 is gone, everything gets deleted. Alpha 2 is here, recreate. If you want to migrate from alpha 1 to alpha 2, like, here's a tool to run on your manifests locally. Here are the changes that happened. Adjust your manifests accordingly. That gives you a migration story. It's explicitly experimental. It's early on. There's no server-side transitions required. Once you call yourself stable and you want to attract usage of controllers and clients and manifests and things, and you want them to keep working into the future, at that point, you're constrained to additive only changes. And so all you can do is add fields and remove fields at that point. You can remove fields at version boundaries. It's tricky. Like, you could say in V1 beta 1, you can write this field. Anyone who wrote this field, the data will stay there forever. In V1, we no longer allow you to write that field in new objects, but we still have the field there. So all the things you wrote in beta can still be read. Like, additive only, but block writes into fields at points in the future. Like, that's a path you can do. We've done that in core types. The beta allowed something, the GA stopped allowing new objects to have that, but it still round tripped and returned those fields. But like, if you want to avoid conversion webhooks, you have to be a lot more disciplined about like compatibility, or you just say, nope, we're still in alpha phase, we're not compatible, it's breaking changes, delete and recreate on the boundaries. Adding fields, keeping them around forever, not letting new data into them in new versions might get you closer to what you're looking for in terms of sort of being able to observe based on the state of an object. Like, oh, there's a field that was only ever experimental, but it has data in it, which means that a user must have persisted data to it. We don't let you persist data into that field anymore, but this is observably an object that needs like either to be cleaned up or to have the experimental field like mutated into the replacement field. But you don't get to drop the experimental field if you still want data that users wrote into it to be observable and controllers or migrators to be able to do stuff with it.
So I think this is one of the things that's like really, really difficult with the experimental channel split that we have is we currently use the experimental channel to experiment with introducing new fields to otherwise stable resources. So a subset of fields are available in the standard channel v1 on HTTP or on some resource. We want to introduce a new field, propose adding it basically in the experimental channel, and then if it doesn't pan out, delete that. That gets really tricky because we are trying to do that without like bumping the standard channel to v2 or something like that. Or likewise, like right now we have parity between experimental and standard are two different variants of like the same version CRD.
An example being
Yeah.
HTTP route v1 and HTTP route v1 beta 1, which are currently type aliases for each other. Sorry, v1 beta 1 is a
Yeah.
type alias for v1.
Yeah, it's less even though like v1 beta 1 to v1. It's after a thing is v1, we are still trying to have like retain the capacity to use an experimental channel for proposing and like introducing new fields that may get removed potentially without a version bump. We haven't had that except at an alpha boundary yet. That's definitely
you can
an
imagine.
example of this is that HTTP route is so people are talking about retries for HTTP routes, which is a new stanza in the HTTP route CRD. HTTP route HTTP route has already reached v1, so we can add a retry stanza in HTTP route v1 in experimental that doesn't exist yet in HTTP route v1 in standard. We could, I suppose, recreate HTTP route v1 alpha 7 or something in experimental, which seems interesting in other ways. But it may be that after a while of using the retry stanza, we may simply decide that it's wrong and broken and we shouldn't have it. I personally find that unlikely in this case, but it would be possible, in which case it would evaporate from the experimental channel.
Mm-hmm.
But again, HTTP route itself, that resource, to David's point, is a stable resource, but this would be an experimental field.
So there's two scenarios where you have an experimental field and then later decide to remove it. One is that, so take the retry stanza. I don't know anything about it, but
that's okay. Neither do we, really.
So you say this is a new stanza. It's experimental. People can define HTTP routes. They can define stuff under here. We decide this, letting people specify this was a bad idea. It doesn't work at all. Whatever. It's inconsistent. We don't like it. It should go away. Is it the case that every HTTP route that is using this stanza could drop that stanza and be otherwise completely valid and serviceable by controllers? If so, then just dropping the stanza, and as soon as you drop it from the schema, it gets pruned out from by the server when controllers are reading from it, and it's as if the field never existed. That seems fine. Would you?
In the case of retries, I would expect that to be fine.
Okay.
Yeah. It's less fine if we, at some hypothetical point, tried to do that with authentication as an example. That would be scary.
Because at that point, somebody,
accidentally making private things public if the field gets dropped.
That, in fairness, that might be a little bit of a different scenario, Mike. That seems more like we'd have to take an authentication stanza to standard and then add some other experimental thing within it that we then want to get rid of, right?
So if we're thinking,
it could still be weird.
Like we want to drop an experimental thing and we're actually just fine dropping it on the floor, pruning it out.
Yeah, that's easy.
We don't want to promote an experimental thing, and any object currently using that experimental thing is needs attention. like that seems like a prereq step to clean up those objects before going back to the standard schema. And so rather than trying to treat it as a migration, like it seems like, oh, you can't go back to the standard schema until XYZ gets cleaned up. That seems like a useful thing to be able to detect and notify and or automate the cleanup of that. But I think you have the information you need. Like, it's observable in the objects. It's observable that objects have those fields persisted. And the action is like, stop letting new data be written into this experimental field, detect and clean up or delete use of these experimental fields, and then switch to the standard schema. And I think you can do that by observing the data coming back from the API.
I believe that I agree with both of your points in that I believe that that is observable, and I also believe that it would be maybe not automating the cleanup part,
Yeah,
but machinery
it is. Yeah.
assistance from the machinery on the detection and notification part could certainly be very nice.
So I think that is achievable with something like the dynamic client. If you say, we have a specific field, we know we're not going to promote it, how do we switch back from the experimental to the standard schema? Well, first, we put a policy in place that blocks creation of new objects or transitioning existing objects to use this thing. So you sort of stop new data getting in, then you query and say, find all the objects that are using this field and either notify or clean up or like whatever. If the cleanup, dropping it is safe, you can just drop it. If it's not safe, you notify. And then once there are no objects using that, then you're good to proceed switching back to the standard schema. It's certainly a more active management than just apply this old CRD manifest, but I don't think you can get away from actively managing it. If you talk about like a migrating controller, I think a migrating controller can do what you're describing, but it's a series of steps before you apply back the old schema or the standard schema.
I think that generally we are mostly okay with like the concept of active management. It's just that the guidance around how to specifically do that is not very clear to controller authors as like, this is a reasonable recommended pattern and here's how you do it.
And honestly, I mean, there are also some interesting questions buried in there around things like, how shall we notify the controller authors? We can post a status, we can post an event, but that's an area where we also often get into some questions like that around, what's the best and most recommended way to do that even?
Is it the controller authors that need notification or the person who wanted to switch back to the standard?
Yeah. It's how should the controller authors inform the end user? And that might be spewing log lines as warnings. It could be some other mechanism.
Well, actually, there are two pieces of it, right? One of them is, how should the controller authors notify the end user? The other is, what should the controller authors do and what does it look like if the end user doesn't know to check those notifications and then tries to go back without doing the cleanup? And I believe that the existing machinery around stored versions, I need to think about this a little more, but for the cases we're talking about so far, I think the stored versions machinery can actually, in the V1 case that you were just talking about, Mike, where you're talking about, oh, we need to drop retries or we need to drop an auth field, the stored version machinery may not be sufficient.
Yeah,
Okay, so
knowing
we
I have
are
to I have to
knowing
go
who,
I have to test to see some of that. Yeah, we are
right.
at time. I apologize for burning up everybody's time on all this.
okay. Jordan, you wanted to say something?
I don't know. Getting like end-to-end sort of user stories with the actors involved, like who's switching from
We
experiment
can
table or vice versa, like that seems like the person to tell you can't because XYZ.
right.
Getting clear end-to-end stuff would help.
Yeah, well, we can definitely do that. And Mike and Rob are probably both actually, yeah, Rob's still here. Mike and Rob are both probably laughing at me because in the Gateway API meetings, I'm usually the one saying we should get user stories around this. Um, so I feel a little bit hoisted by my own petard, but hey, that's okay.
That feels like a good actionable next step. So yeah, that's something
Yeah,
that we definitely
absolutely.
work on and bring back.
Okay.
Yep.
This was a great discussion. Thank you, Gateway people, for coming
Thank
here and
you.
sharing with
Thank
us.
you for hosting us. Yeah, appreciate it.
We'll be back, I'm sure.
Yeah, or we will see each other in a couple of weeks, hopefully,
Yep.
some of you. Okay, thank you, everybody. And I will upload this recording later today. Thank you for coming.
Thank
See you
you.
soon.
Bye.